I would later count 37 missed calls, like a bruise that kept swelling in my pocket, and I would learn that life can look at you and decide not to clap. But that comes later. And on the morning everyone thinks of when I close my eyes, what I feel first is the weight of the gown over my shoulders and the ridiculous, small hope that this day might fix everything that years of invisible work did not. I stand in the cramped, rented apartment I paid for with tips and teaching assistant stipends. And for a moment, the soft buzz of the lamp on my desk sounds like applause I've delayed until now. I am 23, 2 degrees that came with a pile of loans and more nights than I can count grading other people's sentences by the blue glow of a cheap desk lamp. I learned to love the smell of stationery and the way the campus library cleaners push their carts at dawn. I learned to wake before sunrise and do morning shifts at a coffee shop, tamping down enough espresso to pay the rent and keep my phone on so it could ring for work and not for what I actually wanted. I ironed my gown the night before with the focus of someone ironing a promise into cloth. I set the cap on the counter and worried at the tassel until it trembled like it knew something about to happen, because I had convinced myself this one day would make me visible to people who had long treated my name like a line item in their life. Logan is 18, long legs and quick smiles, a kid with a clearance to the front row of our parents' attention. He is the soccer star, the one with the highlight reels and the jerseys hanging in his closet, the one Mark and Karen talk about like weather, something to remark on between other things. My parents, Mark with his hands that smell faintly of motor oil and Karen with her voice that slips into tears at commercials, have always had a way of using me as background noise. A proud mention at holidays, a text with a thumbs-up emoji, a that's great when I told them about internships. Logan gets the banners, the backyard throws, the calls from old friends showing up just to be seen with him. I have 2 diplomas, but I grew up in applause that came in the form of side glances. The auditorium smelled of stage polish and cheap cologne, the kind of smell that folds itself into the curtains and comes back when the sun hits the windows just right. The room was enormous in ways I'd only noticed in my head before, with high ceilings that swallowed small noises and held the quiet like a secret. We sat shoulder to shoulder on the hard folding chairs, our caps like small black islands, people murmuring around me and adjusting gowns that rustled like old notebooks. There was a long, cinematic stillness right before the doors were supposed to open, the kind of silence that makes your mouth dry and your hands remember every late night. I kept running through a speech in my head, thanks to the professors, the classmates, the friends who stuck around, the sacrifices. I kept picturing my parents in a front row, 2 faces I had wanted to see up close, imagining them standing for me the way they stood for Logan. I felt a nervous calm I've come to recognize after years of interviews and presentations, the breathing slow, the shoulders heavy with the memory of every shift I'd worked. I smoothed the gown over my knees and looked at my reflection in the dark window, trying not to think about whether the rented car in the driveway could fit all the things I carried. I had rehearsed what I would say if someone asked, "Aren't you proud?" I would say, "I am," and mean it. I had visualized the crowd, the claps that would finally turn my name into something more than a footnote. When the ushers bent and straightened and the first whisper of the doors began, it felt like the moment a lot of small, tired things had been waiting for, like the whole apartment that housed my late nights had finally been invited into daylight. My phone buzzed the way a bad memory buzzes when you least expect it, a tiny, insistent creature in my pocket that I had trained myself not to answer on mornings like this. I pulled it out between breaths and the screen was a river of green bubbles, the family chat I had ignored for years spitting up a whole season of texts at once. Most of them were photos of Logan in his cleats, a cropped clip of him scoring, and messages from cousins I only saw at Thanksgiving. One line read, "We can't miss this, it's everything." Another, from my father and plain as a gavel, said, "It's his future, Ryan, you'll understand." I read it twice because the words felt like a command and then like a punch. For a strange second, I imagined myself closing the phone and going back to sleep, letting the day pass and pretending the gown in my closet was a prop I could return. Instead, I pocketed the phone, folded it into the line on purpose, because making a scene in a campus auditorium felt like lowering myself into a fight I had rehearsed and lost already. I told myself I would be big about it, that I would stand tall and that the absence would be a silent thing they'd notice later. I told myself that as I tied the ugly shoelaces of my dress shoes and smoothed the stubborn wrinkle on my gown, as if pressing the fabric would press a different story into being. The auditorium smelled like polished wood and cheap cologne, a smell that looks good under bright lights and hides 1,000 small betrayals. I walked in with a half-formed speech and a pocket full of missed congratulations, scanned the sea of faces because that was the habit of a son expecting to be found. There were strangers in the front rows with program booklets like shields. There were smiling aunts and uncles I recognized more in habit than affection, but my parents' usual seats were empty, and the places where they should have been looked like a sculpted absence, two clean gaps that refused to be filled by memory. I kept looking as if a blink would reveal them, as if Mark and Karen had somehow been late and would arrive just in time for my name. When they called my name, I got up like I had rehearsed in front of a bathroom mirror, heart thumping against the thin fabric of my chest. The applause that followed felt like it belonged to a different room, polite, muffled, the kind people give when they're waiting to clap for something they really came to see. I walked because that's what you do, because bodies move on schedules of expectation, and the stage smelled like dust and fluorescent lights. Cameras flashed in staccato, phones held high like lighthouses, but most of those flashes were recording faces and moments that were not mine, capturing the ambient celebration, the easy joy of a weekend the crowd had been promised. I remember my smile then, not the full unclenched smile I'd practiced when I pictured home, but a small, practiced thing that fit in a photograph for someone else's scrapbook. I mouthed the thanks I'd prepared, the little speech stuffed into the pocket of my gown like a telegram, and I tried to let the moment be enough. My hands felt like they belonged to somebody else, clapping because bodies know the choreography even when the heart does not. Down in the crowd where my family should have been, there were eyes watching other screens and hands wrapped around cold drinks. The empty seats seemed louder than the applause, a hollow that made every cheer echo off the walls like a reminder. After the ceremony, the crowd spilled into sunlight and the campus smelled like cut grass and 1,000 different futures. I checked my phone again, a reflex now, and saw the same thread blown up with photos and exclamation points, the replay of a goal that happened at the exact same second I stepped on a stage. There were proud parents, aunts who had suddenly become sports analysts, faces in the pictures that looked like they belonged in a highlight reel rather than here. The chat called it destiny. My chest called it something cheaper. I folded the phone closed and like a person carrying a cracked plate I walked away, pretending the silence in my pockets wasn't a mouthful of words they had chosen not to say to me. My phone went off like a siren the second the auditorium emptied, and for a second I thought it was someone out there finally saying what I needed to hear. Then I saw the text from Mark, "Come home now." It was a curt thing, no please, no explanation, just a tap that felt like a gavel. When I opened the phone, I counted 37 missed calls blinking back at me, each one a tiny accusation. I held the phone for a long moment under the shade of the parking lot trees and felt something in my chest shift, because that number wasn't random. It was the shape of the night's demand. I shoved the phone into the pocket of my gown and walked to my battered Toyota Corolla like I was stepping into a uniform I couldn't take off. The car smelled like old coffee and summer sweat, the driver's seat worn smooth where I sat for long shifts and longer nights. I sat there with the engine idle and the gown spread on my knees, thinking about how many times I had gotten up in the middle of the night to drive someone somewhere because my parents liked punctuality more than appreciation. The car hummed in that forgiving way cars do when they are waiting to be given a purpose, and I felt both anger and a kind of stupid, reflexive loyalty knotting in my throat. I called back because that's what I always did. My fingers knew the number like muscle memory. When Mark answered, his voice was impatient, tight around each word like he was packing it into a box and sending it out. "Don't argue, just get home. Logan needs you." He said it like a fact that should close the conversation, like the rest of my day was a loose end to be tied up. Hearing those words felt like someone swapping out my life for a script I hadn't auditioned for, and the pivot to Logan, always Logan, hit like a physical thing. It was the same line he'd used for years when he wanted obedience instead of an explanation. On the drive home, the city slid by in a way that made me feel smaller than the spaces between streetlights. I clutched the wheel until the leather imprinted on my palms and thought about all the times I had answered exactly like that. Stopping papers while I had exams, loaning money I could barely spare, driving my mom to the doctor and then to a PTA meeting, picking up groceries, fixing a flat tire at midnight. Those favors stacked up like paid invoices inside me, and the car kept moving through red lights and suburban yawns while those small debts replayed on loop. Each memory felt less like proof of my worth and more like receipts shoved into a drawer marked "expected." I imagined every bad and good reason for the call: an emergency, a hospital hallway, a real crisis that would make their absence at commencement forgivable. I pictured Logan on the couch clutching a sprained ankle or worse, needing me to be there. I also pictured something less dramatic, a last-minute scramble to keep a story going, another moment of them choosing spectacle over substance. My head filled with the smell of our old station wagon and the sound of my mother's laugh when she introduced us at church, and these memories made me ache in a way I hadn't let myself feel in public. The drive condensed into minutes, but felt like tiny indictments of every unpaid hour I had given away. When I pulled up, the block looked the same mailboxes, same neighbor walking his dog, but everything felt loaded, like a room full of unused applause. The last stretch of road felt too short and too long at the same time, like walking into a play whose act had been rewritten without my consent. I parked, turned the engine off, and sat for a beat watching heat shimmer off the asphalt, my reflection ghosted in the rearview. I remembered being the kid who would always answer when mom called because family was a contract you never questioned. That contract, I realized, had a clause I had never read. You remain available until someone else becomes more important. I stepped out of the car with my diploma folded under my arm and a new sound in my ears, the distant echo of 37 missed calls that would not leave me alone. I pushed open the front door and the house hit me like someone else's party, warm light, the smell of reheated pizza, and a TV playing the same goal on loop. The living room looked like a highlight reel set, empty paper boxes stacked on the coffee table, a red plastic cup sweating on the arm of the couch, relatives clustered like they were at a bar watching a championship. My gown rustled against the wooden floor and no one looked up. The cap I'd straightened that morning sat crooked on my head, and for a second I thought maybe I was invisible in my own skin. Karen glanced at me from the couch without standing and said flat as a weather report, "You'll drive Logan later, he's celebrating with the team." There was no catch in her voice, no softening, just the sound of someone assigning chores. That simple line landed harder than any anger could have because it came from a place that should have been tenderness. Instead, it sounded like a timetable. My time belonged to their schedule, and I had no right to expect anything different. Logan came in 2 minutes later, hair still sweaty, jersey half unzipped, like the whole day had been tailored to prove something. He smirked at the sight of me in gown and diploma and said, "Nice hat." He leaned against the doorway and with a small laugh told everyone he'd used my laptop earlier because his was too slow. "I emailed my highlight reels to some recruiters from Ryan's account," he said like it was a hack and not an invasion, as if using my college email made him look smarter. He even admitted he'd logged into my email because a college email looks better. Those words were casual, and they cut like deliberate hands. My laptop had been more than a faster machine. It was a thing I relied on for research, job applications, and nights grading papers. Hearing that Logan had used it felt like someone rifled through my pockets and filmed a commercial with my name on it. I remember the TV glare making the tassel at my temple seem almost cinematic, and the sound of the crowd in the room synced with the canned cheer on screen. Somebody popped another slice of pizza, and the smell of grease and tomato sauce filled the space between us while I stood there with the weight of years heavy on my shoulders. Mark reached over, picked up my diploma like it was a napkin someone had left behind, turned it in his hands for a heartbeat, and dropped it face down on the desk like it could be made irrelevant by the flip alone. "It's just paper," he said like he was explaining math. The gesture, that small, deliberate flip, crystallized everything I had been feeling in pieces for years. The late nights, the shifts, the loans, the quiet, thankless work that had been expected to disappear into the background. When something you carried proud and careful is treated like trash in 10 seconds, you don't just hear an insult. You understand your whole story has been footnoted. For a few seconds the room blurred and the laugh track of relatives' cheers felt like a recording stuck on repeat. I could hear the echo of 37 missed calls in my head, a drumbeat I hadn't yet answered, and everything my parents had dismissed as small started to format itself into a pattern. This wasn't an accident of timing. It was a house where priorities were spelled with certain names in capital letters. I remember thinking, with a clarity that burned, how many times I'd made myself almost invisible so someone else could be seen, and how long that invisibility had been returned with contempt. The TV kept replaying the goal, the pizza box rustled, and my diploma sat face down like a verdict that had already been given. I sat on the edge of my old bed with the diploma heavy in my hands and the house humming with someone else's victory. My room smelled like childhood, a mix of old sneakers and the faint vanilla of my mother's candles, but the sweetness had thinned into something sharp. I turned the diploma over slowly, the embossed seal cold under my thumb, and felt the anger that had been a hot flare soften into something like steady work. Hope cooled into resolve in a way that didn't feel like surrender. It felt like deciding not to trade my life for someone else's highlight reel. I told myself I would stop asking to be seen by people who had already chosen whom to watch. I waited for the weekend when Logan's roster said he had an away game, watched the group chat explode with photos of cleats and buses like an invitation I wasn't on. When the house emptied, I packed the diploma in a plastic folder, the way you tuck something delicate into a box so it doesn't fold under pressure. I folded the gown and stuffed it behind a jacket, locked the old bedroom door, and slid the key into my pocket. The drive to my one bedroom felt smaller than it should, a short route under sodium streetlights that suddenly represented everything I owned. The apartment smelled like new paint and coffee. I hammered a small nail into the wall above the desk and hung the diploma where I could see it when I worked late. It looked like a talisman then, not a bargaining chip. The job hunt that followed was almost all small things stitched together into a shape that made sense. I forced myself into rituals that felt like armor, ironing a second-hand suit at 2 in the morning under a single lamp, the fabric hissing while I practiced a steady breath. I brewed coffee and wrote out answers to interview questions on the back of old receipts, rehearsed them in the mirror until my voice stopped tripping on the words. I updated my resume for the 100th time, mailed polite follow-ups, and learned to hold my hands like someone who expected to be trusted. I walked the downtown sidewalks with a portfolio under my arm and a map of job listings in my head. One morning, after 3 interviews that felt honest and not performative, a mid-sized firm called back with an offer for an entry-level coordinator role that promised steady hours and benefits. It wasn't a headline moment. There was no confetti. Instead, there was a small stack of onboarding forms and a manila envelope with my start date. On my first payday, I set up direct deposit like it was planting a flag, routing number, account number, and a small, careful plan. I opened a savings account in my name only, no cosigner, no conditional signatures, just my name on the dotted line, and deposited that first check into it with fingers that trembled and then steadied. The bank teller smiled like she knew the difference between a person with a backup and a person who finally decided to build one. I moved part of each subsequent check into that account the same day it hit my balance, a quiet practice of claiming my future. Day-to-day dignity stacked slowly. I learned the names of coworkers, stayed late to help finish projects, and took public transit home, headphones in, listening to nothing in particular. I ironed a shirt the night before every presentation and left a note on my desk reminding myself of the hours I spent reading and the reasons I had chosen this path. I saved for small things first, a solid pair of shoes, a better coffee maker, an emergency fund that would let me say no. I started to enjoy appointments I could keep without someone else's permission. The diploma on my wall watched me do it all, no longer something to be flipped face down, but a marker of what I could carry alone. There was no dramatic showdown, my life just stopped bending toward their urgencies. I learned how to make my own appointments and how to refuse a call that smelled like expectation. Each paycheck built a quiet fence, promises I kept to myself about where my money would go. The decision to move the diploma felt small on paper, but it changed the geometry of my days. I was not waiting anymore for a seat in their crowd. I was building one for myself, one steady deposit at a time, and that steadiness felt finally like safety. The old pattern was a slow leak I had gotten used to plugging with my own hands. A text asking for gas money, a call about rides to work, a casual "can you cover this?" when dinner ran short. It started small, $20, $50 here and there, things I covered because my conscience is loud and my bank was quiet, and because I learned young that helping meant keeping peace. My phone would light up with requests while I was at my desk downtown, and I would feel the tug of old reflexes that used to make me drop everything and drive. Those reflexes had almost cost me my whole life once. I had promised myself that would stop. Then Mark called on a Tuesday afternoon like he always did, voice calm but urgent, and said he needed me to help with Logan's camp. He laid it out neat and rehearsed: fees, travel, coaching, housing, a total that sounded carefully chosen to pressure me without emotion. $7,500. The number landed in the room like a demand rather than a question. "We can't cover everything this year, Ryan," he said. The expectation folded into his tone as if I had a legal obligation to help. It was less a request and more a memorandum of family economics where my name was the line item. I remember sitting at my kitchen table with the city lights leaking through the blinds and my hand shaking as I put the phone down. I thought of the nights I paid rent, the weeks I skipped dinners to scrape together tuition, the car rides, and the simple favors that had piled into a ledger no one else could see. I took out a small journal I had bought that winter and started writing like I was doing an inventory of my own life. I wrote dates and amounts: the $200 I lent in March that never came back, the times I drove mom to appointments, the favor of co-signing a car loan years ago that still sat in the margins of my credit. I wrote the words people used when they dismissed me, "It's just paper," and the exact wording of Mark's voice when he told me to just get home. Ink turned to evidence. Saying no started as a practice of small muscles. I began to refuse being a default ATM. I told mom I couldn't drive that night because of an early shift, told a cousin I didn't have cash to spare, and told myself I wasn't being cruel but practical. When Mark pressed that $7,500 line again, when he pushed the narrative that I owed Logan the dream because I could afford it, I said the safe, ambiguous thing: "I'll think about it." It wasn't a yes. It wasn't a no, it was a hinge. Saying "I'll think about it" bought me time to guard my money and to make a plan without doing damage to myself. In the margin of that time, I started investing in me the way I had once invested in other people's appearances. I signed up for an online certification program in project coordination, something practical for the kind of work I did and something that would make my resume harder to ignore. I networked in small, careful ways, emails to professors I liked, lunch with Jamal who worked in HR, a phone call with Priya who ran a small nonprofit and always had blunt advice. I practiced asking for help that wasn't financial help, learned to trade time and skill rather than currency. The routines I put in place were boring and real and saved me from dramatic gestures. A call from a sports recruiting contact closed a door I didn't know I needed closed. Marcus, a scout friend of a former professor, told me quietly that the odds for most kids chasing scouts were low. Most of these camps are exposure theater, he said, not unkind, the way someone tells hard truth so you can plan. Very few takeoffs, a lot of bills paid for a dream that doesn't fly. That sentence was a soft grenade. It reframed Mark's request not as an investment, but as a gamble with a house where I wasn't invited to the winnings. It made me see the $7,500 ask as part of a pattern, not an exception. So I kept the journal and kept the receipts, filled the pages with dates and conversations and reminders of the small humiliations and big silences. I protected the savings account I had opened in my name only like a tiny firewall. I said no in small ways until saying "I'll think about it" felt like a moral boundary rather than an evasion. I stopped being the family's free safety net and started being someone who measured his generosity. There is something controversial about that. Parents expect loyalty, but loyalty without limits becomes entitlement. I learned to draw the line and to trust that my future deserved the same fierce defense I had once given to everyone else. The promotion came like a slow sunrise, not a firework. An email at my desk that changed my calendar and my responsibilities more than my ego. I moved from paperwork into client work, sat in meetings where people used my name without the polite pause it used to need, and learned how to hold other people's expectations without dropping my own. My raise wasn't dramatic, but it was steady, and steady felt like progress. Enough to stop counting pennies at the grocery, enough to watch the savings number in my account climb without my stomach nodding. My boss introduced me to a mentor, a woman named Claire who smelled like peppermint and spreadsheets, and she taught me to mix safe bets with small risks, an index fund here, a conservative stock there, and to keep an emergency cushion. That cushion finally had a balance that mattered, the kind that makes you breathe differently in the middle of the night. I used that breathing to pay back the people who had actually been there. I wired Jamal a lump sum the night I closed a big client because he had stayed up with me during finals, bringing pizza and edits and belief when I had none. The transfer pinged my phone and the sound made something inside me unclench. His text back had 3 prayer hands and a real, raw thank you that did more to me than any applause. I bought a new laptop for Professor Ellis, the man who had written a recommendation that opened doors, because his old machine had died mid-email and I wanted to give something that would last longer than a thank you card. I set up a small emergency fund for Priya, who drove me to interviews and refused payment beyond the coffee I offered. These were not showy gestures. They were deliberate, permanent things. Wires, accounts, a machine out of the box and running. I wanted to multiply loyalty, not turn it into spectacle. When Mark called about the camp again, I said no, clean and steady, not sharp. I told him I wasn't funding Logan's trip, and I did it with quiet words that left no cliff to be climbed. He tried the old script about family and investment and obligation, and I answered with facts, my budget, my plans, and the same calm I used in client meetings. I recorded the call in my journal afterward, the date and the tone and the exact words for when I needed to remind myself why I had made this line. I kept writing those entries, favors unpaid, loans forgotten, dismissive comments that felt small on their face and heavy in some. The journal grew into a ledger of expectation and a map of my boundaries. I didn't post it. I didn't make a scene. I made records and then used them to protect the thing I had fought for. Relatives began to notice, the way you notice someone at a new job who shows up on time and keeps their promises. At family gatherings, the conversation changed slightly, the way light shifts when clouds pass. There was a new kind of quiet when they asked about Logan's next steps and then asked, a little later, if I could help. Logan's trajectory, meanwhile, started to falter in ways that weren't dramatic but were honest. A rolled ankle that never quite mended right, a missed showcase because of scheduling, a coach who moved on. No one yelled, no one congratulated me like I had triumphed. Instead, I watched doors close for one and open for another, and the contrast became its own statement. I didn't crow about it. I kept wiring money to the people who showed up, kept the receipts, and kept my calendar full of work that mattered. My power, I learned, was not a shout but a steady ledger of things done and promises kept. I invested carefully under Claire's advice, saved without a cosigner, and let my life grow in small increments. A promotion, a raise, a solid laptop on a professor's desk, an emergency fund that meant someone I loved had a cushion. The relatives who had assumed I would always be on call started to shift their questions into requests that met actual resistance. I recorded every interaction quietly, not for revenge, but as evidence that I would no longer be the family's default. In the end, my victory was ordinary and stubborn: a bank account that wouldn't be touched without my say, people helped because they had earned it, and a steady day-to-day life that refused to bend to old scripts. My stability became the reckoning, small and immovable, rather than a grand, noisy undoing. Months slid by and the story at home unraveled the way old threads do, slowly, then all at once. Logan twisted an ankle in preseason and then another one sliding into the same scar. Coaches found reasons for extra training, trainers found ways to bill insurance, and the so-called showcases folded into weekends that cost more than they returned. The big scouts never called back. The highlights that had looked so shiny on the living room TV turned out to be a quiet theater of hope that ate money and left nothing behind. I watched bank transfers from a distance, saw family group texts turn from banners to excuses, and felt the pattern I knew from the diploma face down repeat itself in new ways. Relatives began to notice the seams. At holiday dinners, aunts who once cheered at Logan's every play offered awkward side-eye and asked, in that too bright way people use when they have to talk about a problem they created, "Hey, whatever happened at graduation?" A cousin texted asking if I'd ever gotten any help for my own debt. I answered only what I needed to: small facts, dates when money moved, and nothing that fed the rumor mill. I had a ledger in a notebook where I recorded conversations, sums, and dates, and I added each new ask and each new no. I did not clatter it on the table or wave it at anyone. My record was practical, not theatrical. It was paperwork, not revenge. Work kept anchoring me, the steady thing I had built for myself. I kept showing up at the office, kept keeping promises, let the small victories stack. A client who liked my calm, a mentor who taught me to think in quarters, not heartbeats, a savings balance that no one could reach without my say. When I had extra, I still sent money quietly to the people who showed up: Jamal's kids, Priya's emergency fund, a software license for the professor who had written that letter. I gave to loyalty, not to a family ledger that had never listed me as important. That steady, dull work was the kind of power that doesn't make noise but makes nights easier to sleep. On the anniversary of the ceremony, I ate a good meal alone, the kind you only let yourself have when you understand its price. I went to a small restaurant downtown that smelled like rosemary and toasted garlic, sat in a corner booth under a low lamp, and ordered something I couldn't pronounce a year ago. The waiter poured me a single glass of red wine and the pitcher sang as he set it down. After the plate, I walked back to my apartment with the city's cool air pinning the hem of my coat. I stood for a minute in my doorway and looked up at the diploma on the wall above my desk, its gold seal catching the lamplight like a small sun. I lifted my glass to it the way you salute a companion on a long journey and let the toast be quiet. An old neighbor I'd once shoveled snow with knocked on my door later that week with the kind of hesitancy people have when they carry other people's news. He'd seen my parents at the post office and heard them talk about regrets in a voice that dropped lower than gossip. He told me they had said, "We handled things badly," the words clumsy like they were new in his mouth. I listened. I felt the shape of those words, soft and late, and let them sit without applause. I could have held them like evidence, could have worked them into a speech. Instead, I folded the news into the quiet ledger of my life and let it be one more small fact. I did not gloat, I didn't demand apologies or stage a reveal. I let silence do the work it was meant to do. When the city cooled and the streetlights burned thin, I stepped out into the night and thought about how the diploma on my wall had stopped being something to earn and started being something that said I had kept my promises to myself. The apartment light spilled out behind me and the framed paper glowed in that little pool on my desk. My steps were measured. My breath came steady. The truth settled around me like armor, plain and useful. I don't need them, I never did.